So I'm just going to give an outline of today's session. We're going to start off with an overview of the Accountability for Water research program, and specifically the global evidence review on which this webinar series is based. I'm then going to be moving to introduce some of the key insights emerging from today's theme on closing civic space and the emerging evidence from the literature on how this can influence accountability dynamics in the water sector. I'll then be introducing some of the key research priorities and knowledge gaps that we've identified when it comes to evidence on closing civic space, and trying to get a better understanding of what works, where and why in terms of accountability for the water sector. We'll then be concluding today's session by moving to responses from two professional research fellows who've been participating in the program, Firehewat Sintiahu in Ethiopia and Perestiko Bastori in Tanzania, who've been undertaking original participatory action research on this theme to try and address some of these knowledge gaps that we've identified. We'll then be concluding the session with a short Q&A and discussion. So as I mentioned, please post any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll come to those at the end. So just to give a brief overview of the global evidence review, this is the culmination of a 2-year comprehensive study, which has been a global evidence review of literature relating to accountability and advocacy in the water sector. And we've been identifying different types of literature ranging from academic literature to NGO reports, institutional working papers, and so on and so forth. We published our first overview and summary report in August of 2020. That was followed by a second report on our 5 focus countries in East Africa the following year, and has been concluded with our most recent report on priority themes for water accountability, which was published just a month or so ago. And all of these are available on our website, accountabilityforwater.org, which I'll post now in the chat. If you bear with me 1 second. So yeah, as I mentioned, we've got these 5 priority themes. We've already covered 4 of them in previous webinars: gender, the role of donors, what makes governments listen, how best to measure accountability. And today's session will conclude the series focusing on closing civic space. And what we've tried to do is organize the evidence around 3 clusters. First of all, community dynamics. Secondly, the enabling environment, which can subdue or stimulate accountability. And thirdly, the governance dynamics, which influence accountability outcomes. And we've used this to develop a theory of change, which is also available to view in full on our website. And we have sifted through the literature. We had about 151 high quality papers that we identified for the overall report. And a smaller number of those we identified as a subset for this theme. And we've summarized the key evidence within the report, along with some analysis to help identify knowledge gaps and guide future research priorities. And we tried to conceptualize this accountability process through what we've dubbed the 5 R's of accountability, in this accountability cycle diagram that you can see on the screen now. For accountability to be realized within water governance processes, we believe there's these 5 stages that need to occur. First of all, clear sets of rules, norms, and standards which are in place and appropriate. Secondly, well-defined responsibilities and obligations which are clearly assigned and understood. Thirdly, effective reporting and monitoring mechanisms which are widely available and used. Fourthly, clear process of review and explanation for performance, especially if there's an instance of poor performance by duty bearers from government or water service providers. And fifthly, clear reaction mechanism via corrective measures or sanctions which are effective. And when we're talking about accountability mechanisms or interventions, that can range from social accountability mechanisms such as citizen report cards or community scorecards, all the way through to participatory budget tracking, evidence-based advocacy such as public information or media campaigns, and finally statutory accountability mechanisms, including ombudsman services and customer service charters. And what we're talking about when it comes to accountability is really this relationship between rights holding citizens and government duty bearers. Although, as I mentioned, the duty bearer could also be a different type of water authority, be that in government or the private sector. And when it comes to accountability, it's about trying to really strengthen and clarify this relationship so that duty bearers will respond to citizen demands and needs and effectively react to instances of poor performance, whether that be pollution in a river or inaffordable or inaccessible water services. Now, within the report, each chapter is organized starting with an evidence dashboard, which is aiming to give a visual breakdown of each theme. So this is the one for closing civic space. And as you can see, this is basically a tool to help navigate the report and gives you an overview of the evidence relating to this theme. So for closing civic space, the literature came from a mixture of organizational reports, journal articles, and working papers. The most relevant interventions to this theme were those which focused on strengthening citizen voice and dialogue processes, and to a lesser extent, social accountability mechanisms such as scorecards and report cards were important, alongside budgetary work and grievance mechanisms. You can also see on the right-hand side, in terms of the geographical scope, that most of the evidence for this theme was clustered in South and East Asia, or in East Africa, specifically Ethiopia and Tanzania, with some evidence emerging from the Americas, but very little for Europe or the Middle East. In terms of the sectors covered, most evidence focused on water, sanitation, and hygiene services, with much lesser attention to agricultural water management or water resource management. I'm now going to move on to some of the key insights emerging relating to community dynamics. And these are going to be the headline findings only, because we don't have time to go into everything in detail. I guess what I want to mention is that overall, the evidence that we were looking at showed how increasing restrictions on civil society, punitive laws, and the delegitimization of social activism all hampered the ability of citizens to raise their voice and exercise their rights. And that's some of the kind of key points that we'll be exploring through these insights. And when it came to the role of communities, what we found was that historical experiences of the state often influenced the extent and form of civic association or collective action within communities. So citizens were often deterred from participating in civic actions due to mistrust or resentment generated by early experiences of conflict, war, or state repression. And just to give an example of that, there's a paper by Borgias which focused on anti-dam activism by citizens in Chile who were concerned about the impacts of a new hydroelectric dam. And you can see in the photo, this is a protest from one of these citizen groups. And basically the legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship meant that, there was delegitimization of citizen groups within the public sphere, and water was often narrowly defined in terms of exchange value rather than like its broader use and like socio-ecological values. And there were many diverse examples of how different states could influence citizen participation. So whether that was the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, or political mobilizations for agrarian reform in Turkey, or alternatively, the centralized forms of political patronage which had emerged during post-Soviet transition in Ukraine. These all influence levels of civic participation and the uptake of accountability mechanisms by citizens. Another example was from Nepal's Terai Plains, where past exclusion of certain minority ethnic groups during civil war had bred mistrust and resentment, and this actually resulted in the sabotage of water infrastructure, including pipes and pumps. Another key insight emerging from community dynamics was how decentralization has helped to create new civic spaces and enabled citizens to strengthen accountability, but this has only occurred when local level power asymmetries have been effectively identified and addressed from the outset. Otherwise, there's often been the tendency towards elite capture and like a failure of accountability at a local level. Relatedly, the evidence stressed the importance of access to information and the awareness of rights amongst citizens for determining their participation in community groups and defending this autonomous civic space from intrusion from the state or other authorities. Yeah, there was a couple of good examples from Ethiopia, where the introduction of community scorecards to rank service providers, or in India, where the introduction of a right to information law helped to stimulate citizen participation and increase awareness of their rights. In terms of the enabling environment, one key point to emphasize was how important it was to have open civic spaces for public debate and dialogue, as this really positively contributed to accountability. However, this couldn't be taken for granted. It required sustained proactive support and funding to maintain the capacity. Without it, there was often limited technical, analytical, and organizational capacity within civil society, which limited their ability to mobilize citizens and build strong coalitions. Yeah. Another key finding relating to the enabling environment was that free and independent media was necessary to be able to report on accountability initiatives within civil society and disseminate knowledge to citizens. And external donors and media organizations, which were keen to build up the capacity of local civil society, really need to provide resources for protecting local activists and ensuring the safety of whistleblowers who are exposing corruption and malfeasance or poor practice within duty bearers or water authorities. So yeah, basically this is really crucial information which can activate citizens in terms of demanding more from duty bearers, but people will only speak up when their safety is not at risk. So external donors and those who possess more social economic power have a role to try to do what they can to protect frontline activists who are most at risk. In terms of governance dynamics, perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that authoritarian regimes were the least favorable to participation from civil society, with state officials prioritizing upward accountability to a central government or leader over downward accountability to citizens. And unfortunately, we're seeing this trend across the world with rising levels of repression of dissent and increasing levels of violent policing towards protesters and kind of delegitimization of their role in the public sphere, which has really damaged the ability of autonomous civil society organizations to provide a constructive role when it comes to strengthening accountability in the water sector. And this really requires creative or strategic interventions to circumvent these restrictions on the flow of information, to create public embarrassment through the media, or in some cases to find common ground with the state. So there were some papers here which address this from the Mekong River Basin, from citizens using petitions in rural China to improve water quality, and also from papers investigating the role of social accountability in Ethiopia and Tanzania. And basically there was no one-size-fits-all mechanism which was relevant. It often required tailoring to the local context, looking for strategic openings or more responsive officials at different levels of governance to be able to make effective change. And it's important, like I said, to recognize this is a global trend. So there was a global review by Lands and Fonseca in 2018 who looked at progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 6 on water and sanitation. And what they witnessed was an increasing trend towards excluding civil society from participation in global governance arenas, including from monitoring progress towards SDG 6. So civil society groups were not invited to key meetings, were not given relevant information, or information was hidden and made hard to find. And there was also geographically uneven opportunities for participating in these national level accountability mechanisms. So yeah, this is both a local level problem, which is tailored to the political dynamics and kind of context of specific regions, but it's also a global trend which needs to be addressed at a global level. Finally, to counteract this, there are various strategies that can be taken to defend and protect civic space. Firstly, the literature emphasized the importance of political and civil society alliances at different scales to effectively challenge and resist repressive laws and violence. And there were different ways that this could be done. In some cases, it was important to build counterpower from below outside of formal state institutions and shift from so-called invited spaces where formal spaces for this dialogue were created by the state and citizens were invited to participate on the state's terms, or alternatively by shifting towards claim spaces where citizen groups could carve out autonomous spaces to articulate their own struggles and for water justice and gain their own understanding of their rights through public dialogue. In other cases, though, the better strategy was navigating different openings within favorable state institutions and mobilizing tactical alliances, which could help advance an accountability agenda. So in Ethiopia, for example, this was a few years ago now when the literature dates from, but there were examples of social accountability mechanisms being applied at a local level, and this was received favorably by both citizens and the state and helped to improve access to water at a local level. Finally, there was a perhaps obvious point that CSOs can achieve the most influence over water policies when there is good faith engagement from governments and service providers, when they recognize both the legitimacy of civil society and are willing to incorporate citizen feedback at all levels at all stages of policy, planning and implementation. And this was evidenced in a discussion around the Mekong River Basin Commission, but also many other examples of kind of global environmental governance where citizens were able to influence policy outcomes and stimulate changes when government duty bearers were willing to listen and create space for dialogue. So what are the key research priorities? I think, first of all, more evidence is needed on what constitutes a strategic intervention in different political contexts and how citizens can undertake strategic advocacy to navigate unfavorable political terrain, holding authorities to account under conditions of repression. Secondly, there's a need for more research on statutory accountability, especially tools such as public complaint mechanisms, audit and disclosure, and customer service charters, which could be valuable tools to empower citizens and enforce their rights. And thirdly, there's a need to understand how we can better respond to these moments of crises, which states have often used to justify closing of civic space and limit citizen participation. So how can we protect and sustain citizen involvement and uptake of accountability mechanisms during periods of crises? For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, during wars, or the ongoing climate emergency, which is likely to escalate in the coming decades. So these are all valid questions which should be discussed further. And this is what some of our professional research fellows are starting to do within the program. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce both our professional research fellows. Today, we're very lucky to have Ferehwat Sintiahu, who's an assistant professor at the Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and Perestiko Pastori, who is a lecturer at the University of Dodoma in Tanzania. And they're going to be sharing some relevant insights from their research. So I'm now going to hand it over